Hello, and welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month we're exploring the topic of Zionism. Thank you so much to our series sponsor, Unpacking Israeli History. The Unpacking Israeli History podcast gives a fresh perspective on some of the most controversial and interesting events in the country's history. Catch the current season now and don't miss the special 3-part miniseries on the founding of the State of Israel. Listen to Unpacking Israeli History wherever you find podcasts or follow the link in the show notes. And thank you so much to our episode sponsor this week. I was supposed to have a baby. This week, they are ushering in the inaugural Global Jewish Fertility Support Summit organized by the nonprofit I Was Supposed to Have a Baby, taking place on Sunday, May 7th via Zoom. This summit will include some of the most prominent voices from 15 major fertility organizations worldwide. Whether you're on a fertility journey, a professional, clergy, or lay leader in this space, or if you want to know how to be more sensitive to your friends and family, this summit is for you. Learn more and register for free at iwassupposedtohaveababy.org. 1840 is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas, so be sure to check out 1840.org. That's 18forty.org, where you can also find videos, articles, and recommended readings. I am so excited to present a special episode. We didn't originally put this in our email on the series, and I was looking at what we were doing in our discussions of Zionism, and I realized that there was something sorely missing in the discussion, and that is, at least to me on a very, very personal level, an exploration, an introduction to the thought of Rav Kook on Zionism. I'm going to be completely honest, I have not really spent a lot of time on Rav Kook's writing, but I feel incredibly connected to the thought of Rav Kook. It is something that whenever I listen or I hear, or the little bits and pieces that I've read, that resonates in my soul in a very, very personal way. And I think people who know me, particularly people who see the way I interact online, and I shared this once, I think can appreciate why Rav Kook resonates and kind of animates so much of my thought. I think it's something that both people who enjoy what I do and people who absolutely hate what I do can appreciate that connection. And I think it's because Rav Kook, more than anything else, was really conciliatory. He tried to bridge opposites. He tried to find truth in opposing ideas and find goodness and holiness wherever he found it. Now, I obviously don't embody even a droplet of the greatness of Rav Kook's personality and writings, even making a disclaimer on a podcast that, hey, don't confuse me for Rav Kook is absolutely absurd. But I feel like it always needs to be said. He in many ways is my inspiration in the way that I look at the world. And there is one particular letter that really had a big impact on me. It is the 79th letter in his collected writings. And I'm just going to read for you. I'm going to be very brief in this introduction, but I want to read for you what he writes in this letter because it's about how he looks at the world and how he looks at all of the fighting and dissonance that we find in the world. And he writes as follows. I'm going to read it in Hebrew and then of course I'm going to translate. Klal Gadol Omer L'chvodo. I'm going to tell you a great principle. Shahahashkafa hayoser me'ira be'inyane emunos v'deos. The more elevated, the more enlightened approach when it comes to looking at differences of opinion and differences of approaches to faith, kamo b'chol inyanim nisgavim, like all lofty matters, hilatzes mehachug hatzar. It is to leave our myopia. It is to leave our smallness. Shabo nimsaim shitos mechulakos. It's in that smallness that we see all of this divisiveness, all of this argumentation. Hatzoros zu et zu umavatlos elu es elu. These opinions that seem to be irreconcilable, that destroy one another, that pursue one another. Vilavo, and instead to approach, to enter admarom haspiska, this elevated, more supernal way of thinking, shemisham nishkafos koldeos bishrasham, that it's in that more transcendent world that all opinions are rooted in, that all ideas are rooted in. Eich shakulan olos lamakom echad, to realize that all of these differing approaches ultimately share the same source. V'rak shinoi tanoim be'orchos hachayim. They're just kind of different conditions and approaches in the way that they're applied in everyday life. Ubematzav hanefashos hu hamachalik beinehem. And it's within the differentiation of the individual souls, the reality of different people's life, that they seem so divisive. But ultimately, there is an underlying unity to the world, and there is an underlying unity to what seemingly divides us. And I think on all topics, certainly in Zionism, certainly when you go into Israel and you see so much fighting between different sections and sectors of the Jewish people, it's hard not to hold on to this idea from Rav Kook. The notion that we need to leave, lotzeis mehachug hatzar, to leave our smallness, to leave our own myopia, and some way, somehow, lavo admarum hapiska, to have some way of elevated thinking, of not just to kind of be this partisan approach that this team is always right. Sometimes in the Jewish world, it feels like it's a big game of color war. Who's right? Who got the most points? And to try to look at the underlying values that everyone is negotiating with, and that there's an underlying truth to everything. Now, this approach works very well if you are a thinker and maybe more mystically inclined. It actually does not lend itself well to politics, to say, I see both sides, everyone is right, everyone has some truth to it, which is probably why I'm such a terrible politician, and probably why I find the fighting and the battles of any area of politics, but particularly political Zionism, it's so lost to me. I have a hard time staking a flag in one camp because I'm inspired and animated so much by Rav Kook's thought in seeing that underlying truth that exists in each community. There's this amazing story that Rav Eitam Henket, Hashem Yikom Damo, may his death be avenged, who unfortunately was killed in a terrorist attack, one of the great thinkers. And he has an article about an exchange between Rav Kook and his young student Rav Hutner following Rav Kook's speech at the inauguration of Hebrew University. A little bit later, it was found out that in Hebrew University, they were going to be teaching biblical criticism and things that, Rav Kook certainly did not approve of, things that would definitely question and erode people's faith. And there's an exchange. It's said in different ways, but essentially, Rav Hutner said with a little bit of a sharpness that was characteristic of all the things that he said. He kind of chided, maybe in a way, his Rebbe, Rav Kook, and said that you, Rebbe, Rav Kook, are able to see the shoresh of everyone's neshama. You're able to see the roots of everyone's soul, but because of that, it sometimes distracts from where their actual legs are standing. Sometimes when you focus so much on the underlying unity of everything, you can pay less attention to where people are actually standing. And I think it's that very tension that I struggle with in my own life. I definitely veer sometimes too far to looking at the shoresh of people's neshama, the underlying holiness that animates our lives, and you could sometimes get distracted from where their legs are actually planted. But I still remain deeply moved whenever I read Rav Kook, and I was thinking we can't talk about this topic, at least without exploring, mentioning, and just reminding people about the enduring relevance of Rav Kook's thought. I think particularly in this modern world that we live in this divisive world we live in, his thought is so important. And that is why I was so appreciative of Rav Bezalel Naor, almost an enigmatic figure. I didn't appreciate his brilliance and his greatness. I had always thought that he was a translator, which probably is even a double mistake, because to be a translator might be the most gifted and most elevated form of Jewish thought, to be able to present ideas in translation, something that my dear friend Rav Joey Rosenfeld sensitized me to on his academia page. Academia is this website that houses people's articles, and on Joey Rosenfeld's academia page, he labels himself, what is his profession? He says, I'm a translator. And the loftiness of being able to translate ideas from one language to another, from one set of thinking to another, may be the loftiest thing that somebody is able to do. But I thought, okay, he takes things from Hebrew and writes them in English. And I read a book of his over Pesach, Navigating Worlds. He has so many books, and we're going to try to link to many, if not all of them, and allow people to explore his work on Rav Kook. But I was floored. I went through all of the footnotes. Really, really jaw-dropping. His command of such a breadth of writing in mysticism, in traditional works. He is I don't know if this is an insulting word, but it's a word I love. He's a desultory thinker. He's a wandering thinker. His mind wanders from topic to topic, from tangent to tangent. He's not a sequential thinker in that way. He's not laying it out like a textbook, but there's something very free-thinking, free-flowing, very poetic, both about Rav Kook's writing, but I'm talking about the way Rav Bezalel Naor thinks. And it was really a privilege and pleasure to be able to speak with him. And just as a quick note, it comes up in the interview, something that was particularly heartening is that when I first reached out to him and connected to him, I mentioned that my grandfather, I don't know why it came up, but I mentioned my grandfather, Rabbi Bekritsky, Rav Moshe Bekritsky, and he stopped me and paused and says, was he a Rav in Portland, Maine? I said, yeah. How on earth did you know that? And he said, I'm from Bangor, Maine. And I was absolutely floored. And he told me two incredible stories about him and interactions with my grandfather, one involving one of my favorite figures, Rav Kasher, Rav Menachem Mendel Kasher. That's for a different time. But I found like we were two people who should have already been connected. Finally meeting, being able to have a discussion with him was really an absolute privilege. He is a world-renowned expert in Rav Kook, somebody who brought Rav Kook's writing, both in Hebrew and in English, of the first to really bring his writing to a broader audience, which is why it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our conversation with Rev Bezalel Naor. I wanted to begin our interview with a letter that I have no doubt that you are familiar with, that was written in 1921 by the third Gera Rebbe, the Imre Emes. He spent time in Israel in 1921 and met with Rav Kook, and afterward, in a letter that he wrote afterwards about his impressions, he was writing in Hebrew, but he wrote as follows, talking about Rav Kook. He says, Ulam, however, ahavaso l'tzion, his love of Zion, overes kol gvul, breaks and almost transgresses all boundaries. Ve'omer al tamei tahar, and he declares that which is impure to be pure. Umar lo panim ka'osa she'amru b'chazal, and he basically looks out and interprets and sees things that should be impure and looks at them as pure. And I wanted to begin with the criticism of Rav Kook before we even get to what it means to us today. Why do you think Rav Kook was such a recipient, we're so targeted on the criticism of the way he related to Zionism? What do you think he meant by it? Do you think there is anything correct in the assessment that his love of Zion, ahavasa l'tzion overes kol gvul, breaks all boundaries?
Yeah, I'm very familiar with the letter. I published it in the introduction to Orot that I brought out. It was written from a ship on the way back from Eretz Yisrael to Europe. And the Ger Rebbe compares Rav Kook to Rabbi Meir,
the Tana, the figure from the Mishnah,
and gets into the Gemara Eruvin,
exactly
13b. Lo yadu chaverav l'sot dato, that as great as Rabbi Meir was, his contemporaries could not follow his thinking. And I discussed the letter, as I said in the introduction to Orot. Rav Kook might actually have been flattered that he was compared to Rabbi Meir. I don't know whether the Imre Emes, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, was a ruach Kodesh. He might have been, but it's as if he read Rav Kook's Shoresh HaNeshama, the root of his soul, because Rav Kook himself, as I've pointed out in other writings of mine, identified very much with Rabbi Meir. So that was very on target on the part of the third Gera Rebbe.
Could you explain more why Rav Kook compared himself to Rabbi Meir, and why do you think it was apropos and perhaps even flattering that he compared him to somebody who the Talmud describes as somebody who we never really got to figure out what he meant? We were never Yored Lasov Dai. We never fully comprehended what he was trying to say. Why do you think that would be a compliment, and what do you think we should make of that?
Rabbi Meir was seeing things that the rest of us don't see. He was a lavlar. He was a sofer, and Breshit Rabbah, it says, B'Torato shel Rabbi Meir, there was in the Torah scroll written by the hand of Rabbi Meir, there was a significant deviation where we have Tov Ma'od in Breshit. He had Tov Mot, Tov Mavet.
That death is good. I just want to translate. That death, so to speak, is good.
That's right. So you're getting this amazing theodicy. I'm using some jargon, some technical philosophical jargon. You have this amazing theodicy, this Siduk Hadin, where Rabbi Meir is able to see the good in death, which is no mean feat. And Rav Kook has this ability too. Tov Roi, he's able to see good where other people see evil. He's able to see light where other people see darkness. In one of his writings, and there's so many, and I don't want to belabor the points. I'm not
Feel free to belabor. I want to understand the world of Rav Kook as you see it and understand it.
Yeah, Rav Kook is a whole world. His literary oeuvre is so voluminous, and we haven't seen all of it yet. In one of his many writings, he quotes the Zohar that Mashiach has this ability to transform darkness into light and bitterness into sweetness. And Rav Kook is a futurist. Of course, he, as all of us, he's confined to the present, but his vision extends into the future. It's a very optimistic future. People ask me, did Rav Kook think he was the Mashiach? Did his followers think he was the Mashiach? And I don't think so, but he definitely felt that he is privy to this, what he calls the Orot Mashiach. That's a recurring theme. In the book Orot, you get this phrase, Orot Mashiach, the light of Mashiach. So he thinks that he can see into a messianic future that most others are not privy to. So he probably was highly flattered with what the Ger Rebbe wrote, which might not have been intended as flattery, but it's like he read the Shoresh HaNeshama, the root of the soul of Rav Kook. This is Rabbi Meir.
But what's so interesting to me is that this is in 1921. This is before, and maybe we'll get to this, Rav Kook's famous eulogy for Herzl, which got a lot of attention, both within the secular world and in the religious world. That seemed to be very transgressive to eulogize somebody who themselves was not observant in the way that he eulogized him. What do you think in 1921 gave away Rav Kook's love for Zion, his ahavaso shel Tzion, that is overes kol gvul? How do you think this was manifest at that point in his career and in his life?
Let me read to you something.
Please.
This is something that Rav Kook's son, Rav Tzvi Kohen Kook, who was my teacher. Baruch Hashem, I had the zchut to have many private one-on-one sessions with him. This is Rav Tzvi Kook writing from Halberstadt, Germany, Motzei Shabbat Hagadol in 1914. And Rav Tzvi had left Eretz Yisrael. He was in Halberstadt, Germany, and this is what he writes. I'm translating from the Hebrew. Regarding my father, there is a difference of opinion between the Zionists and their Orthodox opponents here as to which camp he belongs. To my questioners, I responded that when it comes to the rebirth of the land and the sacred tongue, and in general, our national establishment, we are with the Zionists. And when it comes to the destruction of Judaism, the throwing off of Torah and commandments, and the gentilization of education and lifestyle through the work of the Zionists, we fight with the might of opposition and concerted action. This is a very good statement of the Zitzim Levin of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook. His son has summed up very well where Rav Kook stands. So he sees eye to eye with the Zionist establishment when it comes to rebuilding the land, the language, and working for the political independence and sovereignty of what would become a Dinat Yisrael. But when it comes to tearing down Judaism, what he calls gentilization, they do not see eye to eye, and Rav Kook would fight bitterly, put up very stiff opposition.
I wanted to ask you about kind of Rav Kook's initial falling in love and his alignment with Zionism and where you think that began. Rav Kook was born, in the 1860s. I think you probably know the exact date.
1865, yes.
1865. And he was a student of the Netziv. He learned in Volozhin. Where do you think Rav Kook first fell in love and first, the mythical figure of Rav Kook that we know now that is adorned and associated with the religious Zionist movement? Where do you think that Rav Kook was first born?
I recently reviewed Yuda Mirsky's book. It was originally his doctoral dissertation.
Towards the mystical experience of modernity, the making of Rav Kook. I'm looking at it right now. It was published by Academic Studies Press, and he has a second biography by Yale, which is a little bit more digestible, that's from their Jewish Lives series.
At first, he published in the Yale Jewish Life series.
Yes.
Which spans the entire lifetime of Rav Kook. But what has come out recently by Academic Press in Boston is a refurbished doctoral dissertation.
Yes.
Of the first 39 years of Rav Kook. That's 1865, when he's born, of course, and it takes you up to 1904, when he assumes the rabbinate of Jaffa. And I reviewed Mirsky's book, and one of the things that Professor Mirsky shows is that in this early phase of Rav Kook's life, practically the first 40 years, he lived to be 70, so the first 4 decades of his life, you don't see in his writings a fixation on Eretz Yisrael. He may talk about it, as every rabbi, right? Every rabbi speaks about Eretz Yisrael. There doesn't seem to be this fixation, this fascination with Eretz Yisrael that we see in the later writings. That's a surprise for many of us and comes as a shock to many of us. I speculated, well, first of all, I quoted something mystical, which I learned from my teacher, Rav Tzviuda. It's a passage in the Chesed Avraham by one of the great Jewish mystics, that's Rabbi Abraham Isaac, who says that the first night of your aliyah, when the Jew makes aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, you pick yourself up and move to Eretz Yisrael. The first night, your old neshama of Chutz La'aretz leaves you, and there descends a new neshama, and when you wake up in the morning, you have a new neshama of Eretz Yisrael. If you're a Kabbalist, you would take that literally, I suppose, but it can be taken figuratively. Something happens to Rav Kook when he arrives in Yafo, and there begins this great love affair, this great romance with Eretz Yisrael. The Ger Rebbe says that it was too much. It was overly romantic. So that's one of the transformations. There's another interesting transformation that could go hand in hand with that, and that's the exposure to Breslov Hasidus. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov does not come into Rav Kook's orbit in Europe. In Yafo, he is exposed to Breslov Hasidus.
Through who?
Well, that's a good question. The Breslovers say that it was by one of their great manhigim, probably the greatest at that time, Rabbi Avraham Rab Nachman Halevi Chazan. And Breslov is known as Rabbi Avraham Rab Nachman. And he was the one who introduced Rav Kook to Breslov Hasidus. My teacher, Rav Tzviuda, was a closet Breslover. I don't know if you're aware of that.
And why do you think Rabbi Nachman's writing had an effect on his love for Eretz Yisrael?
Rabbi Nachman has a tremendous love of Eretz Yisrael. There are some very interesting statements about Eretz Yisrael made by Rabbi Nachman. One of the statements goes like this. You might think when I talk about Eretz Yisrael, I'm talking about something metaphysical and spiritual. No. I'm referring to these houses. He says in Yiddish, Heiser, these houses, these buildings. So don't get the wrong idea. When I speak in this impassioned tone about Israel, you see them, you might think I'm talking about the Elamus Helyenim, it's
supernal worlds.
Yes.
The realia of Israel is where he found holiness.
That's it. I'm talking about the Mamashis. Now, I'm going to segue. I'm known to do that.
Please.
You spoke about Ger. So one of the great men I had the privilege of meeting this lifetime was the son of the Imreamis. His name was Reb Pinchas Menachem Alter, the Pnei Menachem. Originally, he was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva Sfas Emes. Later, he becomes the Ger Rebbe, the Pnei Menachem. He wasn't only a Hasidic Rebbe, he was a great Torah scholar. That's what Gur is really all about. In fact, Rav Tzviuda once told me that when it comes to the Hasidim, yesh v'yesh, meaning there are some that are Torah scholars and some that are not Torah scholars, but he singled out for honorable mention Chabad and Gur. He said, they're B'nai Torah. He said, some of the other groups may not have been such great Torah scholars, but Lubavitch and Gur, they knew how to learn. And Pnei Menachem's son today is Reb Shaul Alter. I'm sure you know quite a bit about Reb Shaul Alter. So he continues his father's tradition of being a phenomenal Gaon, a Torah genius. Anyway, I'm going to share with you something I heard from the Pnei Menachem. I went to be Menachem Ovel, the Boston Rebbe in Har Nof. His name was Levi Yitzchak Levi Horowitz. I'm from New England, spent a lot of time in Boston. The Bostoner lost his older brother, Ramosha Horowitz, who was the Bostoner in Brooklyn. And I went to be Menachem Ovel, the Bostoner Rebbe. It was in the afternoon. It was a strange hour. There were very few there. We could count them on 5 fingers. If you want afterwards, I'll tell you who was there. But the most distinguished was the Pnei Menachem, Reb Pinchas Menachem Alter. He wasn't yet the Rebbe. He was the Rosh Yeshiva Sfas Emes. And the discussion was all about Eretz Yisrael. And the Gerers, they're excitable. They're passionate. They can raise their voice. They raise the tone, the decibels.
Sure.
So I'm sitting there, and opposite me is Reb Pinchas Menachem Alter. And he made a statement. The whole conversation was in Ivrit, by the way.
Okay.
Not in Yiddish, which was good for me because my Yiddish is weak. My Hebrew is much stronger. And I'll translate what he said. He said, you know, when the Ramban, who's a great Bible commentator, Moshe ben Nachman, when the Ramban speaks about Eretz Yisrael, Zelo allegoria. It's not an allegory. And I was amazed. How does he know the word allegory? It's like I'm listening to a professor from Hebrew University, but he was a very broad-minded individual when you got to know him. He said, Zelo allegoria. When the Ramban speaks about the sanctity, the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, and that all of the mitzvahs belong to Eretz Yisrael, and that whatever we do in Chutz La'aretz, it's just going through the motions. But the real Kiyum HaMitzvahs, the real performance of the commandments is in Eretz Yisrael. It's not an allegory. And then he gave a bang and he said, Mamish. It's reality.
Wow.
So you could hear in that whatever you're reading in his father's letter about Rav Kook, the truth is, the truth known to both the Ger Hasidim and to the Hasidim Rav Kook, there was a great love between the Ger Rebbe, the Imre Emes, Rabbi Abraham Alter, and Rav Kook. And I could tell you so many stories about the love between the two men.
Allow me to introduce one other variable, and we'll move along in Rav Kook's life, but I want to fast forward a little bit, not to Rav Kook, the one that we know today, but the Rav Kook that often gets overlooked is the period during World War I when Rav Kook gets stranded outside of Israel. This is after he was the Rav of Yafo, before he is elected the chief rabbi of Israel, and he is stranded and becomes a Rav in London. And I think for many of our listeners, particularly those who don't have the opportunity to live inside of Eretz Yisrael, much like myself, I'm curious, what do you think we could learn from the period in Rav Kook's life? This is after he's exposed to the beauty of Israel. This is after the romance has already begun, and he's forced now, he's blocked out of going back to Israel, and he's forced to live outside of Israel. What do you think we can learn about Rav Kook's relationship to Israel, Rav Kook's love for Israel, from the period that he was forced to spend outside of Israel?
He was always very connected to Israel, even when he was in exile. Well, first, he spends at least a year in St. Gallen, Switzerland. He had no Rabbanus there. He was the house guest of Avram Kimchi, who had Rachmanis on him and took him in and set him up in his home. From Switzerland, he becomes the Rav of the Machzike Hadas. in London's East End. It was a congregation of East European immigrants. He always felt connected to Eretz Israel. There was always tremendous gaguim, nostalgia, I guess would be the word, longing in Yiddish, Bengshaft. And he was always working for Eretz Israel. And it really was fortuitous that he was in London at that time, because he was there during the Balfour Declaration, and he militated for that. In fact, there was a session of the British Parliament. There were Jews in London who were opposed to the Balfour Declaration. There was a fellow by the name of Montagu, Montagu, and others who, for whatever reason, thought it's a very bad idea. They were opposed to what the Zionists were doing. You had Chaim Weizmann and Nachum Sokolov, who got Lord James Balfour on board. In one of the sessions of Parliament, one of the MPs asked a rhetorical question: who knows what's better for the Jewish people, Lord Montagu or Rabbi Kook? He really had input into that process. Behind the scenes, Rav Kook was militating for this Balfour Declaration. And I guess that's something that we should try to apply. If we're living in Chutz La'aretz, we should always be connected to Eretz Yisrael. There's a cute anecdote about Rav Hutner, Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, who was a disciple of Rav Kook in Jerusalem when Rav Hutner was a young man. And Rav Hutner said that he always saw himself as a Ben Eretz Yisrael, even though he was living in Brooklyn, and he rose to fame as the Rosh Yeshiva of Chaim Berlin, and today it's on Coney Island Avenue in the Flatbush section of Brooklyn. But he said, I always viewed myself as an ambassador from Eretz Yisrael who will one day return to my home, which he did. At the end of his journey, Rav Hutner settled back in Yerushalayim.
Rehova Kablan.
The other thing is not only to feel connected to Eretz Yisrael, but we should all be activists. We should all be working, I don't know if behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, working for the good of Eretz Yisrael.
Do you think there's anything to be gleaned from what he was writing and what works he spent time on, specifically during his time outside of Israel when he was fleeing, meaning what was occupying his written time, what Torah he was being drawn to?
I heard from my teacher of Tzviuda that in London, this would be 1917, his father, Avraham Yitzchak, received a tzav. That was Rav Tzviuda's exact word, which I questioned, and he repeated it again. Make sure I got it. Tzadivav is a command, a mandate.
A mandate.
Yeah.
Okay. From who? Who did he receive this from?
A mystical command from
a
on
heavenly
high.
Command. Okay.
He was commanded to bring out two works. One, Reish Milin. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I sure am. I'm fascinated by it.
It's a mystical work. It's Rav Kook's own Midrash HaOtiyot, his own Midrash on
the letters of the Aleph Beis. It goes letter by letter, starting Aleph, Beis, Gimel, and talking about the mystical significance of each letter in the Aleph Beis. What you're saying is you heard from his son that he got a almost divine mandate.
Yeah.
That his father, Rav Kook, who we're speaking about, got a divine mandate to what? To explore the Aleph Beis.
To write this work. Now, someone who was a Talmud of Rav Kook in London wrote that whole Sefer, Reish Milin, was produced in under a week. So it sounds like there was some kind of inspiration where he brought out this whole Sefer in under a week. The other work that he was mandated to produce was the Halacha Brura. This is a very prosaic halachic work, where Rav Kook jotted down in the margins of his copy of the Talmud the halachic decisions, the Piskei Dinim of the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch. He did it from memory. He had a phenomenal memory. And afterwards, the editors checked, and they found out it was pretty much perfect. In a few places, it was off, but it's quite amazing to have all of that in your Kapila, the entire Rambam, the entire Shulchan Aruch, where you just, on every sugya, you write in the margins the halachic upshot. The reason Rav Tzviuda shared this with me was this was our first impactful meeting. I'm not going to go into it. I was very young in in my early 20s. I was newlywed, and I'm meeting Rav Tzviuda for the first time in his home in Yerushalayim. And he offered me to work on this project, which is an ongoing project. The Talmidim, Merkaz Rav, they do this. Rabbi Stern, who was the Rav of Yerushalayim, was the head of it for a while. And I guess in order to entice me to work on this, he said, in London, my father got it and he said to me, he said, the same tzav, the same command that told my father to write the Reish Milin, told him to write the Halacha Brura. So that's how he tried to entice me, because he figured out that I'm a Reish Milin enthusiast, and he'll tell me that the other work is coming from that same level of inspiration, so I should get to work on it. But I politely demurred, because frankly, it did not hold out to me the same allure as Reish Milin.
I understand that.
Eventually, some years later, I wrote Orot on Reish Milin, which were published in Sinai. I was the first one in. Since then, others have written commentaries on Reish Milin. Well, actually, Reb Chaim Yaakov Levin, Rabbi Levin's son, did some work on Reish. He was a Talmud of Rav Kook, also for Baruch Ber. It was published in Yeshurun a couple of years ago, but I'm talking about published work. So Chaim Yaakov Levin had a manuscript, which during his lifetime was never published, but I was the first one to publish commentary on Reish Milin, and since then I was the Nachshon, others have died since then. So we have a man living in London in exile from his home. His home was Yafo. He's living in exile, and he's working on two projects. Now, the first one I understand, Reish Milin, because at times of crisis, and this is World War I, London was being bombed. So we know at times of crisis, people turn to mysticism. That's when people turn to Kabbalah. So I understand why he's working on Reish Milin. And by the way, his Talmud Muvhak, Rav Yaakov Moshe Chalab, back in Yerushalayim, wrote that the only way his Rebbe could have come out with such a work of mysticism in Chutz La'aretz, in London, he said that there had to be a tzinor, there had to be a pipeline from the Kodesh HaKodeshim in Yerushalayim all the way to Rav Kook's residence in London. So that I understand. As I said, at times of crisis, people are looking for answers. They turn to mysticism. The other project, the Halacha Brura, which is Halacha, is difficult for me to understand. I don't understand that. It seems out of sync.
I understand your question. Meaning, the Reish Milin, I understand, and I knew that was from that time, and I wanted you to speak about it, because it's almost like getting back to the essentials, getting back to the basics, and that mystical underpinning of reality itself, which when the world is being turned upside down, to write a mystical work on the Aleph Beis, as fascinating as it is, it also makes a certain degree of sense if you understand the personality of Rav Kook and the personality of mysticism itself. Do you really not know, or do you have maybe an inkling of a thought for why he was so attracted to also write Halacha Brura, this more cut and dry halachic work during this period?
It could have been a continuation of what he was attempting that decade in Yafo. Rav Kook, as I said, he arrives in Yafo in 1904. He sets sail for Europe in 1914 to attend the Knessia Gdola of Agudat Yisrael at the invitation of Morenu Yaakov Rosenheim, which is highly ironic.
Aguda.
The Aguda, right. But at that time, Rav Kook was on very good terms with the Aguda. The falling out comes later. So in that decade, from 1904 to 1914, Rav Kook grabbed a hold of the most promising young Torah scholars in Jerusalem. One we mentioned, Yaakov Moshe Chalab. Another was Tzvi Pesach Frank. In fact, they called him Yisham Hirsch Pesach, introduced Rav Chalab to Rav Kook. And another one was Rabbi Yisrael Porat, who in the United States became the chief rabbi of Cleveland. These were budding Torah scholars, young men who came under Rav Kook's wing in Yafo. And Rav Kook is already thinking in terms of a new derech halimud for the Chachmei Eretz Yisrael, that it's
a new approach to Torah learning.
Yeah, a new methodology. We're not going to be learning Torah the way we did back in Europe. And he publishes things along these lines, that the Chachmei Eretz Yisrael, they can't just be nachmachers, imitators, imitating the East European style of learning. and they're called upon to produce a new method of studying Torah. So I think he was already starting to think along such lines, and I guess this tzav, as my teacher called it, was the Maggid Patish to come out with the halacha brura.
It was the final strike that allowed him to kind of begin this methodology in clearing a path to almost a clearer path in Talmud study, which is really marks a lot of what halacha brura is about. It's not really as concerned or as occupied with some of the lumdus, the finer distinctions and fancy analysis. It's almost like a clearer paved path to approach the Talmud with.
Yeah, I'm going to share with you another anecdote which bears out what we're saying. One of the great European Rosh Yeshiva was Rav Shimon Shkop, Rav Shimon Yehuda Kohen Shkop, Shari Yosher. And he very much wanted to become the Rosh Yeshiva of Merkaz Rav. That was the yeshiva that Rav Kook created in Yerushalayim in the 1920s. When he comes back from London, Rav Kook creates a few institutions. One is the Rabbanut HaRashit, the chief rabbinate. Another institution he created was Yeshivat Merkaz Rav. And Rav Shimon Shkop very much wanted to become the Rosh Yeshiva Merkaz Rav. The first Rosh Yeshiva was the Tavriger, that's Rabbi Aaron Hakohen Borstein, who died at age 59. He lasted 1 year. He was the first Rosh Yeshiva Merkaz Rav. They call him the Tavriger. He came from a town in Lita Tavrig. Phenomenal Torah genius. But then it was pretty much up for grabs who would be the next Rosh Yeshiva. And Rav Shimon Shkop wanted in. And he was rebuffed. And the one who had to rebuff him was Rav Yaakov Moshe Chalaf, who writes a letter. And it's published. Yeshiva University published a feshre for my dear friend Reb Zvulun Chalaf.
Zeved Tov.
Oh, Zeved Tov.
Well, I read your book, and I saw this in a footnote. It was one of the things that really caught my eye, that you had read Zeved Tov. It was edited by a friend of mine named Rav Ari Zatz, who was affiliated with Bnei Yeshurun in Teaneck and married a close friend of my sister, Michal Galipter. And I saw you reference this letter. Tell me, what did that letter say that you found so fascinating?
Rav Chalab tells Reb Shimon Shkop, don't importune anymore. Give it up. And he says, I spoke to the Rav, and what I'm telling you comes from the Rav. So this is final. Because Reb Shimon Shkop was trying to importune through various Talmidim. One was Reb Zev Wein, that's Reb Wein's father. And Rav Chalab says, so listen, what I'm going to tell you now comes from the Rav. This is final. The Rav does not want your derech halimud. Reb Shimon Shkop had put together a methodology of Hasbara, and Rav Kook doesn't want this for his yeshiva. Rav Kook wants to get back the derech limud of the Gra, of the Vilna Gaon. And Rav Kook, in fact, wrote a super commentary on the Beur HaGra to Choshe Mishpat. And that's what he wants for his yeshiva, that derech limud. If we can capture the derech limud of the Vilna Gaon, which is pshat, no pilpul, no hasbara.
The basic meaning of the text.
Yeah.
Do you think that's connect to Rav Kook's approach to Eretz Yisrael itself? Do you think this methodology that he emphasized so much was connected to his philosophy about Eretz Yisrael?
Yeah. I see you have in your Sefer, Barokas Rachem Tizkor, you have a long letter from Rabbi Bergman. He can set you straight on why Rav Kook's take of the Yerushalmi is all wrong. Because David Halivni Weiss, who's Ari Bergman's Rebbe in Talmudic methodology, came out with this notion of the Stamaim.
Okay.
And that's what you're getting in the Bavli. And you don't have in the Yerushalmi. But Rav Kook didn't know from David Halivni Weiss and Ari Bergman and Stamaim. So Rav Kook, who was given to romanticization, as the Ger pointed out, he romanticized Eretz Yisrael, he romanticized Am Yisrael, he romanticized also Talmud Yerushalmi. So there's in the Igrot Chaya, there's a letter of Rav Kook to the Baal Dorot Rishonim, which was Ari Bergman's first love. That's Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi.
Another Agudist.
Who was a Litvak who goes to Germany and he writes a multi-volume historical work to slug up Isaac Weiss. So Rav Kook writes to the Baal Dorot Rishonim how he sees the difference between the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. And he says in Babylonia, they were bereft of ruach ruach HaKodesh. They didn't have divine inspiration. They had to use their kepelach, the crania, the gray matter. They didn't have the gift of prophecy. But in Eretz Yisrael, Talmud Yerushalmi, they no longer had nevuah, paska nevuah, but they still enjoyed the gift of ruach HaKodesh. So Rav Kook says that's why, if you compare a sugya, a Talmudic discussion of the Yerushalmi to the parallel sugya of the Bavli, you'll see that the Bavli's discussion goes on much longer, it's more convoluted, it's more pilpulistic, and the Yerushalmi is kurz und scharf, as we say in Yiddish. It's curt and sharp. Why? Because they didn't have to break their heads. They had the tzav.
The divine mandate to see through all of the weeds and thickets and forests.
They had the beam.
They had the beam.
Beam of light, the shaft of light. So what the modern scholars will tell you is that that's very beautiful, Rav Kook, but that does not truly account for the differential. The differential is what I was saying before, these stamaim. Well, the Yerushalmi signs off earlier.
Yes, the Rif mentions that at the end of Eruvin. I was wondering, one of the issues that I have had with studying Rav Kook is I don't know where to begin. I have spent much of my life studying the works of Reb Tzadok Hakohen Lublin, who listeners to 1840 have heard many, many times me speak about him. And I feel like I have a better understanding of where to start. He also has many, many volumes of writings, but it's easier to navigate, just like where to begin. I have an easier time finding a way around it. I find that Rav Kook's writing, it's hard to know where to lift it up from, where to begin, how to get those primary ideas. And I think for our listeners, it would be so helpful if you could share somebody who has never studied the works of Rav Kook. Where do you suggest people to begin?
Well, I like Orot.
And just start right in the beginning.
Yeah, Orot, it's a seminal work of Rav Kook. It comes out in Yerushalayim in 1920. It arouses great controversy.
What's the controversy around Orot? What are the passages in Orot that provoked controversy?
In fact, the Gerer Rebbe, Imre Emes, comes from Poland to Eretz Yisrael to make peace between Rav Kook and the opposing camp under Reb Chaim Sonnenfeld. But what ignited this powder keg, it was the Sefer Orot.
What about it?
It was a very controversial work. The Kanaim, as they're called, the Zealots, felt that it's treif posel.
Why? What could ever have given them that impression?
Well, we have to translate treif posel into English.
It was impure. It was not kosher.
That's
what
right,
possibly
that's
could
right.
have been not kosher in that work?
The two statements that riled people the most, there are a couple of them. If you read my introduction to my translation of Orot, you'll get all of that there. But the two that riled them the most, one is Rav Kook says that in exile, we Jews, we neglected what he calls Kedushat HaGuf, which is a term out of Seder Kodashim.
The holiness of the body.
Yeah, but he means the human body.
Correct.
And he says Kedushas HaGuf. We were overly cerebral and we didn't tend to the holiness of the body. And now in Eretz Yisrael, the young people, they're doing hitamlut, they're doing physical exercise in their own way. That's on a par with the Tilim of David HaMelech. Wow. That's very, is there a word conflagratory?
Incendiary.
Incendiary. Okay, it produces a conflagration, such a statement. Like, wow. So young Jews are doing hitamlut, they're doing physical exercise, and that's somehow on a par with Tilim of David HaMelech. That was one statement. Another statement was, we have three kinds of Jews. One kind of Jew who they're not religious, but they do for the land of Israel. They're chalutzim, they're building up the land. And then we have other Jews, shalomei emunah Yisrael, they're pious, but they're very weak when it comes to rebuilding the land of Israel. So here Rav Kook references some Kabbalistic psychology that there's nefesh, ruach, neshama. There are three levels of psychology, of the psyche. So there's nefesh, which is the lowest level, which is the body. And then there's ruach, which is the seichel, the mind. And the highest level is neshama. So he said, look, these Jews, that they're not Shomer Shabbos, but they're doing for the the land. So their nefesh, that lower level, the physical level, is metukan. But their ruach leaves something to be desired. And then the Frume Yidden, the Shalom Emunei Yisrael, the ruach is developed, but their nefesh is very weak. And the ideal is those tzaddikim who are able to combine two together, and they're the level of neshama. Anyway, as soon as you start to criticize the frum Welt, you're going to get into big trouble.
I've come to learn that in my own life.
Okay? Tzaddikim gemurim are gemurim, okay? One does not criticize them.
The holy righteous should be treated as being holy righteous.
Right, the gemurim, the Fartige Menschen, they're complete, they have it all. And who does he think he is to start to criticize us? So Rav Kook started up with the right people, as they say. So that's where you should start. You should start with my edition of Orot as a wonderful historical introduction. It'll give you the backdrop. And the translation, the Hebrew and the English are face à face. So there are people who tell me that they learn to understand Rav Kook's Hebrew from my English translation, because Rav Kook created his own language.
It's very challenging, his Hebrew.
Native Israeli speakers, some of them hook into Rav Kook's Hebrew through my English translation, believe it or not.
No, it's a very challenging Hebrew.
His syntax is impossible. The sentences go on and on and on. And then there are some endnotes.
We've never met. We spoke once on the phone, and, I look at it because we established such a remarkable connection. You had mentioned that you were born and raised in Bangor, Maine, and you had recognized the name of my grandfather, Rav Moshe Bekritsky. I don't need to get into the remarkable story that you told me. My grandfather was a rabbi in Portland, Maine. There are a handful of Jews alive today who have even heard of my grandfather, though he had a very remarkable life. But I'm going to use our connection, our familial, I called us landsmen. We both hail from Maine. I want to use that connection to maybe, ask a question that is a little bit more personal. And it's a two-part question. One is, I want to know what brought you to Rav Kook. You have a very unusual mind, a very gifted, a very synthesizing mind. And I've only read one of your books, but I read every single footnote, and I was floored. You don't really see that all too often, where you were quoting from, what you had at your command. You grew up in Bangor, Maine. You could have been drawn to 1,000 different thinkers. I want to know what drew you to Rav Kook. And then I want to know why somebody who spent their entire life studying Rav Kook, how they justify or understand why they don't live in Eretz Yisrael themselves.
I don't want to speak to the Gavra, this Gavra.
You, personally. Okay.
Yeah, but to answer your question of how I came to Rav Kook, because I think this might help other people, I was not always a Kookian. In fact, as a teenager, I was drawn to Vayol Moshe of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum.
The Satmar.
That's right. I had a not good picture of Rav Kook. I thought that he was a politician, not somebody that I was interested in. I have to be very careful what I say, because Rav Kook is kadosh. But I felt that he had accommodated the Zionists. That turned me off. There was one eye-opener along the way. When I was in the 8th grade, I had a Rebbe who was a Lubavitcher, and he said that Rav Kook was an Adam Gadol.
A great man.
He was a great man. And that was an eye-opener. Until I heard that, for various reasons, I did not think highly of Rav Kook. That's somebody that I would look into his works at all. But when this one teacher of mine, who I respected immensely, and he was not a Mizrachist, he wasn't a kippah sruga, he didn't have a knitted kippah. He was a Lubavitcher chassid, a full-fledged Lubavitcher, someone very close to Lubavitcher. When he said that, so that was an eye. So I mentally filed that away, that maybe I should reserve judgment. Maybe I don't have the total picture. But I didn't go anywhere with that. I was very much into Vayol Moshe. I could probably have repeated it by heart. And in those days, I knew it very well. And when I was around 20 years old, I had a crisis, like a breakdown. It's not a midlife crisis. It's a quarter-life crisis, they call it.
I had one such crisis in my 20s as well.
A quarter life, yeah.
Yep, a very real one, yes.
Okay, well, be prepared for the next one. It's called the midlife crisis. You ain't seen none yet. And I was al Parashat Drachim. I had left yeshiva. I was not yet in university.
Would you call it a crisis of faith? How would you describe the crisis?
I had been given to understand by whomever that there's no place for someone like me in the yeshiva world. That what I'm striving for, what was I striving for? Well, I had three favorite svarim in those days. One was Mor Nevuchim, second one was Tanya, the third one was Likutei Moran. Also looked into Maral. But anyway, that what I was striving for, that really, there's no place for it in yeshiva. Yeshiva is a place for gefes, that's Gemara, Pashan Doset, we study Talmud.
The classics.
And you want to do philosophy and Kabbalah, and this is not your place. But where is my place? So I told you about my 8th grade Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Chassid. The next year, my Rebbe was Rabbi Aaron Rekefet. In those days, his name was Rothkopf, Aaron Rothkopf.
Sure. I didn't know that. Was this in Bangor, Maine?
No. In my life, there's been constant oscillation, okay? So I went back and forth between Bangor, yeshivas in New York, and wherever. Anyway, Rotzo Vashov.
I'm not going to translate that one.
The first time I left Bangor, I was 10 years old. There was no yeshiva in Bangor. Later, it was a day school. Rabbi Isaacs made a day, like your grandfather made a day school in
Portland.
Rabbi Isaacs made a day school in Bangor. But when I was growing up, there was no day school yet. So at age 10, I left Bangor to go to yeshiva. And I was there through 9th grade, at which time I came back, did 3 years in Bangor High School. After I graduated, I went back to yeshiva. And this is the story of my life. There's polarity, constant oscillation between different poles of my being. Anyway, the next year I had Rabbi Rekefet, who's an ardent religious Zionist. And when he saw how dovuk I was to the Vayol Moshe, so he figured he would provide the antidote, which was Igrot Raya. So I came into possession of the 3 volumes of the letters of Rav Kook. But I never opened them because, as I told you, I had such a negative image of the man that why would I even open his farm? So now I'm about 20 years old and I left yeshiva. I'm back in Bangor. At this time, we spoke about times of crisis when you start looking for mysticism. So I would read anything at this point. I read Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. So I was done a Kal V'chomer. If you
you don't have to translate this. You can just sing it out.
If you can read the Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda, so you'll open up the Zionist rabbis.
It can't be any worse, yeah.
But in order to open up the Zionist rabbis' letters, I had to take a deep breath. I had to blow the dust. They were caked with dust. There was a layer of dust that thick
on top of the works.
So I had to take a deep breath and blow the dust off in order to open up the Zionist rabbis' letters. And I open up, oh my God, he's speaking to me. And I experienced a meltdown. It was such a catharsis.
Do you remember what letter you opened up to?
People always ask me that. I do not remember the exact letter, but I can give you the drift of it.
Tell me.
The drift goes like this. And again, you're getting it filtered through my consciousness. But it goes like this. There are young Jews who, unfortunately, are turned off to Judaism. They're disenchanted. And why? Because what do we present them with? We present them with the Torah, which is so dry and so ossified and so lifeless that why would a young person go for that? These people are starving. They're starving for machshava, something that speaks to them, that penetrates their consciousness, that pierces their heart. Whether it's Hakira, medieval Jewish philosophy, such as the Mor Nevuchim, whether it's Kabbalah, whether it's Hasidus, whatever. The punch was, you're okay. They're crazy. Okay, so he ratified my sanity. Here's somebody who he gets me. He understands this is exactly what I'm going through. So I became his chassid. Half a century later, I'm still his chassid, 50 years later.
So answer the second question, though. Half a century later, studying the works of Rav Kook, knowing Rav Kook's love and romanticization of Israel, why do you think you don't live in Israel?
Well, I said I don't want to go into the ad hominem, so I'm not going to go there.
Okay, that's totally fine. But you're still a Talmud of Rav Kook, even outside of Israel. We could be a student.
Well, Reb David, I'm the worst cooknik possible,
Why are you the worst cooknik possible? Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, because, especially when it comes to Zionism, if you want to discuss how Rav Kook overlaps with Reb Tzadok Hakohen, then I'm probably one of the best people to discuss that with. I actually know something about that. In fact, Reb Tzviuda Hakohen Kook discussed that with me. Exactly. The parallels between his father and Reb Tzadok. But when it comes to Zion, I'm the worst. I mean, look at me. I'm here in Chutz La'aretz. I'm the worst possible Jew. I'm the worst possible cooknik.
I think that's part of the allure and part of why I was so drawn. Somebody who was able to remain connected to the Torah of Rav Kook, even in the darkness of exile outside of Israel, to me is the ultimate presenter of the light and the brightness and the shining brilliance of Rav Kook's Torah. And the fact that we're able to draw that inspiration and connection so many years later, a young kid from Bangor, Maine, who has brought the Torah of Rav Kook to the masses and found and shared that light with so many, and the light that begins with a light of illumination of that personal soul, that lostness, that self-alienation that I think everyone has felt at some point in their life, is why I am so grateful to you for your time speaking today, and why so much of your work, and I've only read one. I read your first work. I've seen essays here and there, but I didn't connect in the way that I did when I read it in those second days of Pesach. I may regret this. I usually end my interviews with rapid fire questions. Something tells me that there's no such thing as a rapid fire question with you. But we can.
I'm like the Bavli, not like the Yerushalmi.
Yeah.
It's a long sugya, a lot of stamaim.
Yeah, but I'm going to try anyways. My first question is, including your own works, if somebody wants to learn more, aside from his own writings, but something, the most accessible secondary works on Rav Kook, what would you recommend? We've already mentioned 2 books from Yehuda Mirsky. You've written so many works on Rav Kook. Where would you tell somebody to start in your works if they want to understand and appreciate the personality and the philosophy of Rav Kook better?
Well, this volume of collected essays, Navigating Worlds, there's a huge section in there, coming to terms with Rav Kook. You say you went through that volume.
Yes, I sure did.
So that's something. And by the way, Alex said that he's going to provide you with my works that he published.
Oh, your works are going to be at my table for many, many years to come.
Yes. One is called When God Becomes History, historical essays of Rav Kook. And one of them is his eulogy for Theodore Herzl, Benjamin Zev Herzl, Mispei Yerushalayim. Another one that Kodesh Press brought out, besides Navigating Worlds, it's the Legends of Rabbi Barbachana, with Rav Kook's running commentary, which is fascinating, where he deals with Christianity, and it's just a fascinating world. There are unpublished writings of Rav Kook, but there are also works of Rav Kook that have not been translated into English yet. I know Alec, when I say Alec, that's Rabbi Alec Goldstein, Kodesh Press. I know he has plans to bring out a translation of Linvuchei Hador, not by me, someone else, a younger scholar. That's going to be monumental because this is an entire book, Linvuchei Hador.
To the bewildered of the generation.
Yeah, it's Rav Kook's Guide of the Perplexed. And we figured out that it's something that was produced yet in Europe. At the end of Rav Kook's Rabbit in Boysk, today is Bauska, Latvia, before he arrives in Yafo, he had this whole book, Linvuchei Hador. For whatever reason, it was suppressed until just a couple of years ago. When this is translated to English, it's going to be dynamite. If you thought Orot was incendiary, to use your term, wait till you see Linvuchei Hador.
I am definitely looking forward to that. And again, your book, When God Becomes History, this is the second time that it's being recommended on the podcast. We interviewed Rabbi Dr. Yosef Bronstein, who's a dear friend of mine, and he recommended that book as well to understand Rav Kook's philosophy better. We did an episode many, many months ago on Rav Kook's approach to the development of halacha, which I think was very, very important, and I remain so appreciative to Yossi for that. My second rapid-fire question is, it's a little strange asking you, I may rephrase it, but if somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to take a sabbatical with no responsibilities whatsoever to go back to school and get a PhD, what do you think the subject and title of your dissertation would be?
I would have to think about that. But I want to share with you something.
Please.
This is something from my teacher, Rav Kook, which was reported by Herbert Weiner. There was a great book by the title 9.5 Mystics.
Sure.
Herbert Weiner was a Reform rabbi, I think in South Orange, New Jersey. And he went around interviewing various Jewish mystics, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe.
It's a phenomenal book. To our listeners, if you're still with us now on this circuitous journey, the book that Rabbi Naor just mentioned is called 9.5 Mystics. I have read it. I actually just referenced something from that book a few days ago. It is a jaw-dropping work, but why do you mention it now?
He went around interviewing various Jewish mystics of the day, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. By the way, Rabbi Chodakov, who was the Lubavitcher Rebbe's personal secretary, quipped that if Weiner thinks he's even half a mystic, he's sorely mistaken. Because the half and the 9.5 is the author Herbert
It's
Weiner.
him, correct.
Okay. So Chodakov said if Weiner thinks he's even half a mystic, he's sorely mistaken. And Rav Ashlag and the Nazir and my teacher Rav Kohen Kook. And Rav Tzviuda told me that the reason that he agreed to meet with Weiner was because he was told that Weiner puts on tefillin every day. Because Rav Tzviuda got a lot of flack for that interview with Weiner, so Rav Tzviuda wanted to hatzik at that. So he wanted to justify. He said, the reason that I agreed to meet with Weiner was because I was told that he puts on tefillin every day. So died to the hachi. But Weiner came out with a great quote from Rav Tzviuda. This should be up on the wall. Rav Tzviuda said that the believers have to have more faith and the free thinkers have to have more freedom of thought.
What do you think he meant by that?
Well, he was addressing the contemporary maelstrom, what's going on today and every day in Eretz Yisrael, but it's reached epic proportions lately. A couple of weeks ago, Eretz Yisrael was on the verge of lo aleinu civil war. But this is such a gem, this quote. The believers have to have more faith, and the free thinkers have to have more freedom of thought. But now you want a rapid fire.
There's a lot to unpack there, and if I'm understanding correctly, it seems to be a gentle criticism of the faith that the believers think they already have, and the free thinking that the free thinkers think that they already embody. It's a very subtle criticism of the characteristics that we think we champion are maybe the very areas that we need strengthening in, and that is extraordinarily profound. I really do enjoy that. It took me a second for it to really sink in, but I appreciate that immensely. My last question's the easiest question, but something tells me you're not going to give me an easy answer. I'm always curious about people's sleep patterns. I'm curious, what time do you go to sleep at night and what time do you wake up in the morning?
Another teacher of mine, a great teacher of Yosef Dov and Lev Soloveitchik. By the way, in Navigating Worlds, on the back cover, I mentioned how I studied under both Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Kook.
Sure.
And I try to synthesize them. But Rav Yosheber Soloveitchik said that his grandfather, Rav Chaim, had no Seder Hayom. There was no schedule. That's me. Every day is different. There is no...
I mean, we're speaking now, it's close to 11 p.m., so I am not surprised.
It's helter-skelter. I'm totally unpredictable in that respect. Every day is different when I sleep, when I get up.
I am a similar way. It is in many ways like the title of your book, The Souls of Chaos. We have chaotic souls. It's something that I appreciate immensely, and really for your time, for your work, and I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to speak with me tonight.
I can't thank you enough.
That story that he told about being lost, that feeling of alienation, and then finally opening up the letters of Rav Kook and looking at him as if he was speaking to him. It's an experience I've certainly had with the writings of Rav Kook, though I have not immersed myself in a way anywhere near what would be appropriate of somebody whose words have resonated so much. And I'm not an expert in any way in the writings of Rav Kook, but that feeling of resonating in such a deep way is something that I don't take for granted. And it was a very moving story to hear. And, there were so many names that he throws out and so many stories. I hope that our listeners explore his writings more. I want to leave our listeners with two little pieces directly from Rav Kook. Rav Kook's yahrzeit is not for a little while. It's the beginning of Elul, I believe the 3rd of Elul. But to be able to listen when we're doing a topic of Zionism and not get lost in the, I don't want to call it smallness, but in the divisiveness that comes out when we talk about this topic, and have a more conciliatory approach when we see these very animated debates, to be able to hold on to that conciliatory light of Rav Kook, I think is something that we all need and is incredibly nourishing. So I just want to read two very small things from Rav Kook. And this is the translation, again, is from my dearest friend, Rabbi Dr. Yosef Bronstein, who I mentioned in our conversation. Rav Yosef Bronstein has this incredible collection, it's not publicly available as far as I know, of translated pieces from Rav Kook. He has two pieces from Shmona Kvatzim, both that really resonate and I connect with and give me strength. The first one, Rav Kook writes, Hatzadikim Hagadolim, the great, great leaders, Kololim b'nishmasim es hakol. Their souls encompass everything. V'yesh lahem kol hatov shel hakol. They encompass all of the good of everything in the world. V'gam kol hara shel hakol. And they also encompass and include within their souls all of the evil of the world. V'sovlin yisurim ba'ad hakol. And they suffer great sufferings for the sake of everyone. Umakablim oneg mehakol. And they get joy from everything. Umahapchem eskol hara shel hakol l'tov. And they're able to transform all of the evil, all of the pain, all of the suffering. They find a way to transform it to good. Umitoch shehem mismatkim al yedei hayisurim shalahem, and through their sweetening of their suffering that they are sovel shehem sovlim, that they go through, that they bear, hakol mitmatek al yadam, everything is sweetened through them. Ki b'shoresh nishmasam, at the root of their souls, nimsa koach shel siifei haneshamos harabos ma'od. They are able in their soul, they have the strength, I don't know if I'm translating this correctly, of all of the slivers of all of the souls of the world, shehatzadikim heim yesodam, that they're able to find a place in the souls of the very, very righteous. And that's a piece about, containing multitudes, about being able to see good where it's apparently very bad, and being able, even through pain, even through difficulty, even through criticism, even through suffering, to be able to transform and find goodness even in what apparently seems to us to be not so good, to be wrong, to be bad. They're able to encompass those multitudes. And finally, I want to leave you with a prayer. It's a prayer I wrote about in the essay of what Zionism means to me. It's so beautiful. And I want to end with this. It is also found in Shmona Kvatzim. The first piece that I read in Shmona Kvatzim is in the first chapter, number 210. And this is in the sixth piece of Shmona Kvatzim, paragraph number 71. And Rav Kook writes a prayer for Israel, and this I believe he's writing when he is not in Israel, he's outside of Israel, and he writes as follows: Halev mitgagea acharei hahasaga shel Eretz Yisrael. The heart yearns to comprehend, to realize, to actualize the land of Israel. Acharei ha'amuna shel Eretz Yisrael. The faith of the land of Israel. Acharei hakedusha shel Eretz Yisrael. The holiness of the land of Israel. Aye lokem es hasimcha shel Eretz Yisrael. Where do we take the joy of the land of Israel? Es hashalva hapnimis shel Eretz Yisrael. The inner tranquility of the land of Israel. Es hadveikus shel Eretz Yisrael. The connection, the unity of the land of Israel. Es ha'emes shel Eretz Yisrael. The truth of the land of Israel. Es ha'oz v'ha'omet shel Eretz Yisrael. The strength of the land of Israel. As habitachon she'aret Yisrael, the faithfulness, the confidence of the land of Israel. Chusa Hashem, rachem na kel rachem v'chanon. Please God, have mercy, have pity now. Chamol na v'zakeni na loshuv elecha b'tshuva shalema. and return me, please, to the land that you desire. V'hashiveni na al eretz chemdascha, zakeni na liros besimchos goyecha. Let me merit to see the joy of your nation. Lihit'alel im nachlasecha, to praise your inheritance. Rachem, Rachem of Harachaman. Have mercy, mercy, our merciful Father. Chusna, Hoshiana, Hakel HaMoshiach. Take pity, save us now, the God who saves. This is a prayer for Rav Kook. He's far away from Eretz Yisrael, and he's reaching out in that yearning for the land of Israel. I think for all of us, no matter where you find yourselves, I think it's a prayer that in some ways, in some recesses of our hearts, must resonate with us, must find that place. Chusa Hashem rachim na kel racham v'chanon. Have mercy on us, v'zakeni na lashuv elecha b'tshuva shalema, that we should all merit for that ultimate return. V'hashiveni na el eretz chemdascha, to return us back to the land that you desire. So thank you so much for listening. This episode, like so many of our episodes, was edited by our dearest friend Dina Emerson. And as a bonus episode, she really had to put in a crazy amount of work to make sure that this episode was able to be released on time. And I, on a very personal level, am so appreciative for all of her heroics. It wouldn't be a Jewish podcast without a little bit of Jewish guilt. So if you enjoyed this episode or any of our episodes, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You can also donate at 1840.org/donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. Thank you again to Unpacking Israeli History, our series sponsor. We are so appreciative. And thank you, of course, to our episode sponsor. I was supposed to have a baby. Again, tune in to their inaugural Global Jewish Fertility Support Summit that is taking place on Sunday, May 7th via Zoom. You can register for free at iwassupposetohaveababy.org. Check out their incredible work on all social media channels. And you can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play on a future episode. That number is 917-720-5629. Once again, that number is 917-720-5629. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18, followed by the word 40, Forty. 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.